Greetings, everyone. Thank you very much again for joining us today. My name is Aziz Al-Gashiyan. I'm a senior fellow and director of geopolitics here at Observers Research Foundation, Middle East, ORF Middle East for short. 2024 started with a bang, and it's clearly ending with one as well. Perhaps a series of bangs, in fact. While the world's eyes were focused on the Gaza war, the ceasefire talks between Israel and Hezbollah, not to mention the Trump election victory in the United States, few were expecting what was taking place in Syria late November. Anti-Assad rebels, namely Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but not exclusively them, stormed through regime posts and captured area after area and city after city in astonishing quick time. After the capture of Hama, then Homs, the question quickly changed from if Assad will fall to when Assad will fall. On December 8th, 2024, and after more than 5 decades of tyranny, oppression, and intimidation, Bashar al-Assad was president of Syria no longer. The Assad regime has finally collapsed. Syrians and many others around the world celebrated the infant stages of a post-Assad era. As there was an immediate sense of joy, the immediate question of what now was inescapable. A question perhaps is asked with a mixture of both anticipation and anxiety. So what now is not just a question for Syria. I think what now is a question really the region has been asking. It's been asking that. It's been on this quest for some time anyway before the Assad regime's fall. To engage with us and to engage with these questions further, I'm happy to be joined by 3 expert panelists who could guide us through these points. So I will introduce them one by one. The first panelist, As'ad al-Ishi. As'ad al-Ishi is a Syrian economist and a civil society activist based in Brussels. He's currently executive director of Baytana Syria, a civil society support organization that seeks to be a hub for Syrian civil society organizations and empower them through capacity development and grants. Randa Slim is the director of conflict resolution and Track 2 dialogues programs at the Middle East Institute and a non-resident fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced and International Studies, Foreign Policy Institute. A former vice president of the International Institute for Sustained Dialogue, Salim has been a senior program advisor at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and a guest scholar at the United States Institute of Peace. A long-term practitioner of peace-building processes, she is the author of several studies, book chapters, and articles on the conflict of management, post-conflict, peace-building, and Middle East politics. Last but not least, Iyad al-Rifa'i is a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. His research looks at the development of the Middle Eastern regional system by exploring the historical interactions between identities, Arabism and Pan-Islamism, and states, and the struggle for hegemony in the region. His research also focuses on international relations of the Middle East, state weaknesses and failures, state building, security and legitimacy. Currently, he is seeking to examine the public policies in the Gulf states, precisely in Saudi Arabia, and how they relate to the broader region. So, thank you very much to you all. It's a real pleasure to join you. I'm very honored that you guys are joining. And let's start off with a series of rounds. As'ad, I'm not going to ask you a question here. I may put you on the spot and just say, As'ad, you're from Syria. You take the floor. You tell us what you want us to hear. All right, and over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much, Aziz. Thank you for having me, and thank you for ORF Middle East. Let me start by the good news. The Assad regime is gone. This is on its own a reason to celebrate, not only in Syria. Celebration fire rounds in Beirut on the day of the fall of the regime were even louder than they were in Damascus. This was a regime that, played the hegemon role over Lebanese politics, over Syrian politics, tried to sabotage the transition in Iraq by sending jihadis across the border. This is the regime also that played with the Palestinian cause for 61 years. So Palestinians, Iraqis, Lebanese, and Syrians all have a reason to celebrate the departure of this creature, of this monster that ruled by iron and fire for 51 or 54 years, the father and then the son. Obviously, in the minds of international, but also in the minds of Syrians, what comes next? Okay, we celebrated, we partied, we took to the streets, and we conquered our streets for the first time ever since 1980. So it's been 40 plus years that Syrians were not allowed to publicly celebrate anything that they wanted to celebrate rather than regime celebrations on the streets of their capital or on the streets of their second biggest city, Aleppo. But now is the big question. What comes next? As they say in Arabic, راحت السكرة وجت الفكرة. So now is the big question of what's next. There are good signs and there are worrying signs. Let's start with the good signs. It's clear that the new administration in Damascus is saying, at least saying, so far or until 2 days ago, mostly the right things. And I'm talking here purely from a Syrian perspective. I'm not talking about international or Arab or any implications, but purely their dialogue towards the Syrians, their narrative to Syrians has been an inclusive narrative, a narrative of protection, and a narrative of hope, and a narrative of stability. These four items are exactly what the Syrian people are looking for. We want protection of civilians. We want a light at the end of the tunnel. We want prosperity, and we want stability. And these are the 4 points that the new administration played on. They also talked about inclusion in a less clear way. And they talked about peace and justice, but also not in a very clear, structured way towards. And I'm talking here again towards the Syrian population. For the past 48 hours, we started seeing some diversion, whether when it comes to issue of inclusion of women and women participation in public life. There were different statements made by different leaders of the current, establishment. Some that are inclusive, but some that are very exclusive and almost unnerving. When you hear one of the political bureau person saying, "It's not a woman's role to fight," you're like, okay, have you even studied your own history? Like, have you studied Islam, right? Have you heard of Ma'arak al-Jamal? Have you heard of Al-Khansa, etc., etc.? So, like, forget about, Western values, because we're always accused of being Westernized, right? Just read your own history before making, stupid statements that will make you look not that smart. Just study your history, study Islam properly, and then come and come to us and say these things. So that's one thing. The second thing is the way the narrative is shaping around the issue of minorities. It's shaping purely on the basis of protection rather than inclusion as citizens, as equal citizens of the new Syria. So that's a bit dangerous too. And we're all for, of course, protecting everyone, all civilians, including minorities. But we want every Syrian to be part of the new Syria, and we want every Syrian to feel that this new country is hers or his, right? And that they're able to participate. That's also a bit shaky in the narrative of the current administration. Their focus on just addressing religious leaders of the different sects and different religious denominations is a bit concerning as well. Although they keep saying we don't want a sectarian rule in Syria, we're not going to build the new Syria along sectarian lines. Their focus on only receiving so far religious leaders, whether Druze, Christians, Ismailis, and even the Sunni sheikhs and the Sunni scholars of Damascus yesterday, tells you that, okay, the talk is one thing, but what we're seeing in terms of action is starting to become a bit concerning. But let's not forget, we're judging a period of less than 2 weeks. We also need to, not raise too much our expectations. And second, let's not forget the background of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was at least part of Al-Qaeda. Abu Muhammad Sholani or Ahmad al-Shara was the aide de camp of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. It was upon Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's request that he went from Iraq to Damascus. So we're talking about a group that was very much, and I don't know if it still is, a Salafi jihadi group that has taken control of the country. And the big question is, what are they going to do? Because we are in uncharted territory. We're used to moderate groups radicalizing, right? We've seen that in history. But we don't have a precedent where a radical group suddenly decided to become moderate and engage in non-violent political action. So we're writing, as Syrians, we're writing history today, not only for Syria, but also for the de-radicalization movement, generally speaking, and that potentially, actually, maybe when non-state radical groups turn into a state actor, maybe there is a potential of an inclusion there and a potential of de-radicalization. So that's also a focus of Syrians at the moment is, and you hear all that. Are they going to impose hijab on women? Are they going to impose Sharia law? Are women judges going to be allowed to go to court and exercise their profession, etc., etc., etc.? So far, the answer is yes. Regardless of all the rumors you've heard for the past 10 days, women judges in Aleppo, in Homs, and in Damascus are still in the courts, are still chairing the courtrooms where they are, appointed, etc., and they're still dealing with different civilian cases and even criminal cases in some instances. So I wish I had a crystal ball in front of me to tell you what this will look like, but we were expecting so much worse given the historical background that we have on Ahmad al-Shara that, so far it doesn't look as bad as it could have been. Second, with Bashar al-Assad in power, and that's the opinion of every Syrian I've spoken to. Of course, it's not the opinion of all Syrians, but it's the opinion of every single Syrian I spoke to. With Bashar al-Assad, the chances of positive change were 0%. Zero. There was no chance of, moving towards a democratic, inclusive Syria. Today, the chances are 10%. I'm not saying there's still a 90% chance it won't work. But it's up to us, Syrians, who believed in democratic change in Syria, to make the difference now. And the time is now. Not in next month, not in 3 months, not etc. The time to be on the ground, be visible, be seen, and contribute to this country is now. And that's why you're seeing most of the Syrian civil society organizations actually moving back, that were established outside Syria because of many, many reasons, moving back into the city or into the country. And what is so nice about it is they're not all moving back to Damascus. Some are moving to Damascus, others to Homs, to Aleppo, and some are even going to the coast, to Latakia, to Tartus, etc. So that's very important. I'm encouraged by that return of civic action and the civil movement. And my bet is on the people and on this movement to prevent a complete co-optation of the entire state by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Thank you.
Thank you, Assad. I have to also say here, it's going to take more than a jacket and a blazer to not be radical, to not look extreme. It's gonna take more than a nice haircut to do that as well. So yeah, I think you're spot on there. Randa,
but you know, the beard is shrinking by the day.
It's getting short. Yeah,
our bet is that by Christmas it's just going to be like mine, and by New Year it will be completely gone.
Yeah, and then who knows? You could see a mohawk by next Christmas. I don't, but yeah, who knows? But Randa, let's go to you, and I'd like to go from a little bit of a regional perspective, but also take it back a little bit. Pre-Assad fall, this did not, this happened against a backdrop of war taking place. Hezbollah was being pummeled in Lebanon, and the idea of the axis is weaker than it's ever been. Can you speak to the extent of that being a factor in leading to the fall of Assad, or anything else you think that is pertinent?
Thank you, Aziz, for the invitation, and it's really a pleasure and honor to share the virtual podium with you, with Assad and Iyad, and talking about a topic that's very dear to my heart, which is Syria. Just let me have a minute or two to build on what Assad has said about Syria, if possible. I think I've always said to my Syrian friends, some pro-regime, some anti-regime, that with Assad, there was no hope. There was no chance of change, but also with Assad, there was no hope of change. And so now with Assad gone, there is hope. Now, what's going to come out of it? I think we need to give this new rulers, de facto rulers, and the Syrian people time to figure it out together and suspend our judgment until now. I'm talking from from here, being in the US. I think people in the US should, suspend their judgment right now and give them time. And as Assad said, do not underestimate Syria's civil society. I mean, people compare or project their fears on the future in Syria based on what happened in Libya. First, it's two different societies, two different people. But more importantly, what happened in Syria today is 11, 12 years delayed. And during those 11, 12 years, you had very healthy, vibrant civil society, emerge, form itself, develop lessons learned, develop work habits of collaborating, of cooperating, and share and learned a lot from other experiences around the world of transition and change. Granted, we are dealing with the de facto rulers who are basically, Islamist, religiously conservative. But also, let's admit that Syria is in its majority a religiously conservative society as well. I mean, and so whatever is going to come out of it is going to be a reflection of the mood of the country. And I think, talking about Ahmed Shara, I have not met him personally, but friends of mine, colleague of mine whose opinion I respect highly, have met him numerous times, and they tell me he's a practical guy. They have met him over a number of years. He's practical. It doesn't mean he's not ruthless. It doesn't mean he cannot be conciliatory, but he's practical, he's pragmatic, and he learns. You know, he listens and learns and changes. So, as Assad said, push it. It's very important now for the other camp, you know, if we can put it, the civil society camp, to go back and claim their space and contest the political space, not leave it. And it's very important for the countries, for the regional countries, and for the international community not to abandon Syria because of some designation or some. I mean, let's not repeat, especially I'm addressing here Arab Gulf countries. Let's not repeat the mistake of Iraq, where basically they exited following the US invasion of Iraq, and basically Iran took over. And it was right there. No contestation of that space. I think right now, everybody needs to be there, need to contest that space. There are misgivings, but you need to be there and support, you know, the trend, the trajectory that is good. But more importantly, I think, less intervention, in my opinion. I mean, help the Syrians claim and decide their own fate and their future, and less intervention and less putting conditionality and roadmaps. You should do this, you should do that. The Syrians can do that. And then, I mean, so that's my advice right now. But, you know, we'll see how things go forward. Now, in terms, back to your question, Aziz, look, about a year and a half ago, I was invited to a major security conference in this country. And I remember saying in my presentation, which was focused on Hezbollah at the time and the axis of resistance, I was saying that's a year and a half ago. I was saying, based on number of indicators I was seeing on the ground, that axis and Hezbollah have reached their peak, and that after that it was going to go downward. And
before October 7th or after October 7th, this conference?
Before October 7th.
Before
October 7th. Yeah. And it was mostly pivoted around the issue of governance, their failures on the governance side. And that from now on, I mean, the increasing demands of their population, their constituents, is going to focus on governance, not the issue of, you know, resistance, not the issue of that's before October 7th. Now, October 7th, you know, happened, and for a while, you know, you saw increasing power, but then now you see total decimation. But and remember, then it was a humongous conference, and then I remember people kept saying, "Huh? On what basis are you saying that? That's, I mean, this is how can they reach their peak? How can it be going downward from there?" I said, basically, it's based on analysis, right?
Yeah.
That of dynamics on the ground, that it was going to be very hard for Hezbollah as well as other actors in the axis to maintain that level, and it's going to be you know, going on a downward trajectory from there. And then October 7, and then now we see what's happening in Lebanon. So could the revolution, could the change in Syria have happened without the pretty much decimation of Hezbollah? I don't know. To be very honest, it's a question that should be analyzed. I mean, but also, could the regime of Assad have sustained itself all these years without the support of Hezbollah and the support of the Russians? I mean, so you need to ask both of these questions. And I think the argument is that that regime could not have sustained itself all these years, you know, given all the conditions, the sanction it was under, without the active support of Iran, of Hezbollah, of Iraqi militias, of the Russian regime. Now, granted, the foot soldiers on the ground were less the Russians. The Russians were there to protect the regime in the international arenas, the Air Force, but the foot soldiers on the grounds were the Iranians, they were the Hezbollahis, and they were the, you know, Iraqi militias. And once Hezbollah's foot soldiers were no longer able to provide the kind of support that they have provided starting in 2012, 2013, remember, the Battle of Al-Qusayr changed the conflict trajectory in Syria. And that was 100% Hezbollah people. It was not Iran, IRGC, and it was not the Syrian regime. It was 100% Hezbollah people. And I would argue that since Al-Qusayr battle and that conflict trajectory shift, it was going to be harder and harder, for the opposition to reverse that trajectory. It was already on a pro-regime trajectory. And then you had the Russians enter in 2015, and that solidified that trajectory until recently. And so yes, in a way, without the major losses, and we have yet to estimate accurately the level of losses that Hezbollah has incurred. We know its military command was pretty much wiped out. We know most of its political leadership council was pretty much wiped out. We know a lot of their foot soldiers, operative, second, third level operatives, 4,000, 5,000, were injured in this pager attack. And many of them are no longer able to fight. Most of them are no longer able to fight. They have lost thousands, of fighters since the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, recent invasion of Lebanon. And their communities have been totally devastated. I mean, whether it is in the south, whether it's in the northeast, whether it's in southern suburbs of Beirut. And that also is going to go a long way in determining their ability to inject themselves in any other conflicts, And so, having said that, I think if it were not, yes, I would say that Hezbollah's losses, their inability to help the regime support itself, was a critical factor in its demise. However, I think the most important factor, it was one of those independent variables, but that need to be studied. But it was necessary, but not sufficient. I think the sufficient causes were what was happening inside. I think we did not understand from the outside the low morale the Syrian army was in, the disorganization it was in, the absence of loyalty anymore to the Assad family, the level of corruption that had broken any kind of loyalty, the level of disarray within the regime itself, within, service organization fighting among each other with each other, for any slice of power. And that has created the milieu, the internal milieu, that enabled, what happened to happen. And that was a necessity. And in my opinion, again, not enough by itself, but all of these variables together, and then the Ukraine war, of course, which has taken Russia in terms of priorities, which has forced Putin and Moscow to prioritize its fighting power and its resources on Ukraine. So all of these coming together, mostly it's the internal dimension, aided by these external changes, external dynamics, which eventually brought us to a tipping point, and then the thing happened.
Thank you, Randa. And it's also the years of coup-proofing, perhaps, that just kind of hollowed this kind of, the system that you're mentioning, this internal kind of hollowment that taken place. And I think, one of the reasons why is because I think so many people were perhaps fascinated with not the collapse, because you were talking about, you even mentioned these things in a paper we were doing, I think, at ORF, we were doing some research, and it was in 2016, you were even mentioning that Russia was, it's not going to be, they're not going to sacrifice so much for Assad, that Assad was being too costly, to keep alive. Yeah, that he was becoming too costly. It's easier to support a regime that's there, but when it's a regime that's hollowed out, it's a different.
Remember, I mean, we have yet to know the exact specifics of the compact or of the agreement that was struck by Soleimani and with Putin in 2015, prior to the Russians entering the Syrian theater. And I mean, based again on secondary information, is that basically the idea was, you provide us the air force, right? The air power. We provide the foot soldiers, right? Yeah. And then you get in return X bases, you know, although he had already a base there, but you get that and that in return. So it was very much a transactional, you know, deal that Putin got something in return. But most of the fighting power was provided by the Iranians, by the Fatimiyun, Afghani, you know, Zainabiyun, Hezbollah, you know, and the Iraqi militia. Those were the fighting power of the regime. Yes.
Thank you, Randa. Iyad, let's go to you. Vantage point from Saudi Arabia. Saudis, of course. I just want you to also, if you please, add in anything else that you wanna that you heard and share your thoughts also. But of course, tell us what you know, what's the perception of how are the Saudis looking at this? How are Saudi people looking at this? Just as a fellow Saudi, what's very fascinating with being in the streets, seeing celebrations of Syrian people.
Indeed.
By the way, Saudis were celebrating things and carrying the Syrian flags as well. You know, so it was something that we all celebrated. And so I'll pass it over to you. I'll stop talking. I'll give it to you.
First of all, thanks a lot, Aziz. It's really a pleasure to be with you. Thank you to the ORF family, everyone who's involved in organizing this, and really brilliant remarks by Assad and Randa, as always. I'm learning from you. Well, it's been a very interesting moment to watch the reaction from the people, from the media in Saudi Arabia, and from different parts of the country, from different levels of intellectuals, of people who are interested in policy making. It's been a difficult time with Bashar al-Assad. Saudi Arabia had a very difficult time, let's say, since 2005, since the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri, and after that moment in the war of 2006, when Bashar al-Assad said about King Abdullah and about the royal family in Saudi Arabia, they are half men, because they did not want to get involved in his actions with Hezbollah. So it's been a very difficult moment with Bashar al-Assad for a while. And since 2011, the public was engaged in that, the Saudi public, after what we have seen, the atrocities we've seen in Syria since 2011 till the fall of Bashar al-Assad. The Saudi public was very involved, as most of the Arab countries, as most of the Arab publics around the Middle East. So it's a deserved moment to celebrate the fall of Bashar al-Assad. It's a deserved moment on many levels, not only on the public level, but also intellectually, politically. Bashar al-Assad was, he was one of the main actors of a project that really is against what Saudi Arabia looking for in the region. The axis of resistance is really against what Saudi Arabia hopes for. Stability, development, economic liberalization, all of that. Bashar al-Assad was versus all of that. So it is when you see someone like al-Assad falls, it's interesting, and it's very learning moment as well, personally and also on the public level. Saudi Arabia tried since 2021 to re-engage with Bashar al-Assad in a movement that started with also reconciliation with Iran and with maybe the axis, or the countries that are representing the axis. We are talking about Syria, Iran, Iraq, and Yemen, not with Hezbollah that much though. It invited Bashar al-Assad twice. Bashar al-Assad was present at two meetings in Saudi Arabia. It asked al-Assad to stop the drug industry that he is providing all of his infrastructure, all of the state infrastructure to make Captagon, which is something unbelievable, something unacceptable in 2024 to see such a flood. I mean, on weekly basis, Saudi Arabia would catch around 20 million pills. I mean, tremendous amounts of drugs was, pouring over Saudi Arabia. We haven't seen any action from al-Assad, and maybe the videos that we have witnessed since his fall tells you how much the Syrian state was invested in making Captagon. That's on the drug part. Secondly, Saudi Arabia asked Bashar al-Assad to move towards another economic or a new economic project, more economic liberalization, because al-Assad regime is a very socialist regime, and the state cannot really move on in Syria without economic liberalization. He did not move on that front as well. Also on the security level, he did not engage with any real reconciliation process with the opposition forces, with the forces in Idlib. Also, he was advised to reconciliate with Erdogan. He did not listen to that advice as well, not only from Saudi Arabia, but from other GCC countries. And also, some would say from Russia as well. Russia advised Assad to really reconcile with Erdogan, to move on the North Front, to re-engage with the political factions in Syria. We haven't seen any movement from his side, only disappointment, which was, would normally lead to his fall. His political strong hand was mainly led by Russia and Iran. And when Russia and Iran face hard times, he will fall easily, because he depended only on force, only on fear, only on using power against the public. He did not change anything else, but continuously using power and using force against his public. So that was very understood that he will fall. It's a matter of time. Now it's a new day. We are trying to understand the new forces in Syria, the new administration in the country. We've seen an interesting media outlook, or a media dealing with the new government in Syria. It's moved from maybe against that, at the beginning of the uprising in November, it wasn't the most exciting times in Saudi media. But after the fall of Assad, we've seen a shift in that, in that representation of the opposition forces. So everyone is learning from this process. Everyone shouldn't rush to judgment, and we should give time to the new administration. We should give time also to the regional forces to understand the new reality in Syria, to engage with it rationally, not only from a point of just hating it or loving it, but rationally engage with it in a political manner. And we will see what is going to happen. I think this is a honeymoon right now, a honeymoon moment. We shouldn't rush to judgment, but things are not looking so pessimistic, to be honest with you. But things are more on the optimistic side, especially that we haven't seen much of revenge taking place in the coast and in the western areas of Syria. We haven't seen much of toxic, speeches against other minorities. But it's only 2 weeks, so it's very early to judge. However, we've seen the foreign ministry of Saudi Arabia, as other GCC states, welcoming the new changes in Syria and saying that we are standing with whatever the Syrian people choose. We are with the choices of the Syrian public. And that is, I think, a remark that Saudi Arabia always makes when it comes to the Syrian issue. We've seen the same remarks coming from the Saudi foreign ministry when it comes to the Palestinian issue, with the Yemeni issue as well, that we are standing again with the choices of the public in those countries. And I think that is just introduction from my side, and I hope I answered your question, and I gave also maybe a scope on the public reception of the changes in Syria.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, you know, I remember as a young Saudi guy, not yeah, young Saudi student actually, young adolescent, when Bashar al-Assad first became president. And correct me if I'm, but there was a sense of optimism that here was a doctor. Yeah, see, I remember this. I remember hearing this, that, oh, here's a doctor, an optician even. Goodness gracious. So surely he must have
he was
some
under
course.
35.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
he was young, under 35, and they needed to amend the constitution to bring him to presidency. So there was a moment of hope. But that turned to be not very
a year after King Abdullah ascended to the throne in Jordan. So there was this kind of hope that, hey, is there something young happening in young leadership in the Levant. So there was that sense of optimism. I remember, and I think the points that you mentioned about Saudi supporting the Syrian public is really of the essence, and I think it segues nicely back to what I think I want to take it back to Assad. And Assad, I think, very brief questions about Syria civil society. You've mentioned kind of the challenges ahead. Can you tell me what also would you like to see from both the civil society or the support for the civil society from the region? I think because that's a theme that's developing, I think, with all the actors.
Thank you very much, Aziz, for the question, because we absolutely need the region. We are always accused of being only supported by the West, right? Europe, the US, etc. And that's where most of our funding comes from. That needs to change, and it needs to shift, because we need and I'm going to be very honest and blunt about it, we need the Arab legitimacy, we need the Islamic legitimacy. And for that, and that comes from cooperating with, the King Salman Humanitarian Foundation, with the Arab Monetary Sanduq al-Naqd al-Arabi, the Arab Monetary Fund, with the Kuwaiti Development Fund, with the Qatari Development Fund, etc., with the Emirates Foundation, so on and so forth. So we need now a strong presence of Arab financing in Syria for two reasons. One, is the legitimacy, and two is also the how would you say that? The encompassing, I guess, embracement, yeah, of Syria and Syrians, and that we're not being, handed over. And I'm very blunt today. We're not being handed over to the Turks, because my fear is what happened in Iraq, and with the withdrawal of the Arabs and the arrival of the Iranians, would repeat itself in Syria with the withdrawal of the Arabs, but this time it's not the Iranians, it's the Turks, and we don't want that. Of course, Turkey has interests, and I'm not denying that at all. We don't want to push Turkey out, but we need all actors in the sense that we need the balancing act of a Saudi or of a Gulf, let's say, a GCC presence in Damascus. So the fact that Saudi Arabia maintained its diplomatic mission in Damascus, even though the regime was toppled, is a good sign, is a positive sign that they're willing to engage. The fact that diplomats actually met with the new administration, whether from Saudi Arabia, from Bahrain, from Egypt, etc., all of these are good signs. We need more, and I'm specifically here talking about civil society. Don't just play the humanitarian card. Of course, humanitarian work and humanitarian support has the precedence. The needs are huge. and I can go on and on about 16 million Syrians living under the line of poverty, 90%. So that's 90% of the population, etc., etc. So I can go on and on about the humanitarian needs. They're huge. I mean, everybody knows them. But also try to diversify your portfolio in the sense of opening a dialogue, at least, with civic activists, civic actors, local initiatives, grassroots local initiatives. They're more important than us as organized NGOs. I'm more specifically referring to the grassroots local community-based organizations that are the real thing. I'm not saying we're fake, but they're the carrier, the torch bearer, let's say, of that civic movement. So you need, and that's what Europeans and Americans have excelled at, is actually engaging those actors. We haven't seen the Arabs do that, and we need that. We need, especially that the West doesn't have diplomatic missions yet in Damascus, whereas most of the GCC countries, and with Qatar now planning to reopen its embassy too, we will have most of the GCC countries in Damascus in place. So establishing that rapport, establishing that relationship would be easy.
So we're well positioned in other words.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you have you're 2 steps ahead because you're already in town, and there is a lookout towards you because we need that balancing act from Turkish hegemony, right? So yeah.
No, thank you, Assad. I think it just speaks to the point that it's so hard to discern between sometimes domestic implications, considerations with geopolitical, regional considerations. And I'll be very honest with you, I'm trying to separate them. I can't separate them, but because I don't want the question to always be, what's happening in there. What does it mean for us? The questions should be focused on Syria first, but it's what happens in Syria can't stay in Syria, and so I think it speaks to this point. Can you build upon this? Because, Assad mentioned, hey, there's a great deal of support that we need. And also, let me just say this.
Yeah.
I'd like to regionalize this or contextualize this a bit.
Yeah.
From the Saudi support, right now, there is a support, well-deserved support, not well-deserved, I'd say earned, deserved support from Syria. But if I was to say from a very practical or very overly rational, very calculated Saudi approach, I would say, listen, we need to support Syria, but also there is a reconstruction that we've been constantly talking about in Gaza. Okay. Lebanon, there's a constant reconstruction that everyone wants us to reconstruct. And everyone is looking at us, and we have our own economy to reconstruct. So it's a regional challenge because the solutions cannot be separated from coming from the region, but the region itself
indeed
is going through. So over to you.
Yeah, if you follow the Saudi donation or the Saudi, as Assad mentioned, Saudi King Salman Humanitarian Center, since 2015, Saudi Arabia stopped giving money without assurances, and that can be seen also with other Arab countries that Saudi Arabia providing financial assistance to. Saudi Arabia right now asks for an agenda to be followed, for a roadmap, so we can provide, financial assistance. And the financial assistance should go both ways, not only to the country that Saudi Arabia providing money to, but that country should also promise Saudi Arabia that the Saudi business community would have, a stronghold in those countries. So there is nothing free as Saudi Arabia used to do before 2015. I mean, Vision 2030 provided a roadmap to the Saudi administration to be followed domestically and regionally. And one of those steps is not to give money to Arab or to even Islamic countries without having assurances that those amounts of financial assistance would be used domestically in those countries in a very balanced manner and in an economic and a healthy manner without dependency on those financial assistance that Saudi Arabia give. So I wouldn't be worried. Saudi Arabia actually, if we are engaged in a reconstruction process in Yemen, Iraq, Libya, Palestine, or Syria, that should be also seen as an opportunity for Saudi Arabia, not only as a challenge for Saudi Arabia. It gives the country more footsteps in those countries, more footprint in those countries, in a non-political manner, in an economic manner. It would add to the Saudi soft power. It would add to the Saudi presence in those countries in a very charming way, not a very pressuring way. So I would see this as an opportunity for Saudi Arabia. Yes, it comes in a time that Saudi Arabia is very engaged with a domestic project called 2030, but that project, as Prince Mohammed bin Salman said, cannot be achieved without regional stability, cannot be achieved fully without changing the region to be turned to the new Europe, as he mentioned in 2018. So I think this falls all into the Saudi plan for itself and for the region from its outside world. So that would be my answer to this specific question. But I wouldn't take Trump that seriously about what he said about Turkey. I think he is, his way. He's so brash about things, and when he comes to the office or in closed doors, he changed a lot, and he is not shy from changing, from double standarding. I mean, this is his personality, and you can go to Randa. Maybe her connection is right now better.
Let's go. Randa, can you hear us?
Okay, back to Trump. Okay, he said, let's go back to where he was in 2019. Trump wanted to pull the American forces from northeast Syria in 2019, following a series of conversation with the Turkish President Erdogan. He has a good relationship with Mr. Erdogan. At the time, he was convinced by his military advisors, for a number of reasons, the oil wells, Iran, not to pull the forces out. Before the change in Damascus, when the war was taking place, we saw his tweet as well as Mr. Vance, his vice president, basically saying, this is not our fight. We should not get into the midst of it. And remember, Mr. Trump is coming now, unlike in the past, most of his administration is going to be, in fact, the great majority is MAGA people. You are not going to have the traditional Republicans that used to be in the old administration, who were basically arguing for staying in Syria. You are not going to have the neocons who wanted regime change in Iran via Syria. You're going to have the MAGA, many of them isolationist people, who basically are focused, if they are focused on anything, they're focusing on the competition with China, right? They want to finish the war in Ukraine. That's the number one priority in terms of war. And then the second maybe is going to be the normalization in terms of foreign policy priority, Ukraine and the war. China and the war in Ukraine, and then normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Apart from that, it's all domestic priorities. It's all tariffs, it is deportation of illegal immigrants, it is making sure that the courts are transformed in an irreversible way, with lots of conservatives on board. And so I think what we cannot, I think going forward, it's going to be hard for military advisor. By the way, the Pentagon loves the YPG. The Pentagon has trained them, worked with them, supported them, has personal link with a lot of leadership there, and so it's very hard for them, not only strategically, but and not only policy-wise, but personally they are connected to but unlike last time, Trump is coming with a lot of suspicion about the military establishment and the military brass. And so, and again, with lots of people around him who do not believe Syria is a national strategic interest. So what the heck? If Erdogan wants to take it over, let him take it over. So, and that's basically what he said. Erdogan won it, the way he put it. It's a bloodless coup, but he won Syria, right? That's what Trump said in his press conference. And so I don't know how much that's going to change, again, given that dynamic on the ground. And add to that, few of the people who are going to be in charge of the counterterrorism file of the Near East are strongly anti-Islamist, They see any Islamist as a terrorist, right? And so that's why you are basically hearing now words, or news being leaked, that even if the Biden administration were to try to lift the sanctions on Syria, which they cannot do immediately, which cannot do quickly, which the Congress does not want right now, bipartisan view in Congress, that the Trump administration will come and reimpose the same sanctions on Syria. That's what you are hearing now from people who are going to be in Syria position in the Trump administration. And so that's going to be a complicating factor for the US. But also it's a complicating factor for US foreign policy in the Middle East period. I think the Middle East needs to start more and more really internalizing the fact US is not going to play a major part in their affairs going forward. It started with the pivot to Asia with Obama. It has been taking its time. It hits bumps, re-engages, something happens, it re-engages, then withdraws, then re-engages. I think, but the trajectory is definitely away from the Middle East. And we are seeing also the leaders in the Middle East starting to take charge, of their own affairs, which is well overdue, in my opinion. And so, I think, what the US will be doing in Syria is, and I don't know, going forward, it's very hard to predict with Trump, but at least these are, if we are reading the tea leaves, these are the facts, or the bits of news that we have been able to collect together to, suggest what he's going to do, which is not going to be much, to be very honest, in Syria.
Yeah. Do you
I'm afraid really that, yes, the figure of Tulsi, someone like Tulsi Gabbard taking charge of the DNI or NDI, and she is very famous with her dislikeness of the Arab world and the Islamic world since she was a member of the Democratic Party, really. And the way she moved to the Republican Party was really, advanced by her dislikeness of the Arab world, and she is not shying away from sharing her views about Syria. She said awful things about Syria in 2016, 2017, and her taking charge of one of the intelligence communities, the biggest intelligence community in the USA. It's very frightening moment, to be honest with you, Aziz. I only wanted to shed light on. Go ahead.
No, sorry. No, go ahead. Finish your sentence.
No, really, I finished the point. Yeah.
No, but also the person to observe who's going to play a major role also on this is Sebastian Gorka, who's going to be in charge of the counterterrorism file in the White House on the National Security Council. And that's going to be through the lens through which they're going to look at the administration in Syria. I don't know if they even have this gradation that some people in the past, in the current administration applied. You have the radical Islamists all the way to the light Islamists, right? Yeah. And then you have different shades in between. And I mean, for people like Sebastian Gorka, an Islamist, is a terrorist, period. So, so that's the person I will be looking at, and to see how, and his views are well known on this score.
So not only
But
go on, Iyad. Go on.
We shouldn't forget that Trump really likes to be the only decision maker in his, in his office. He likes to, gather people around him, but he's the one calling the shots at the end, and hopefully that will, solve some issues. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, so we have a recipe of unconstructive interventions or potential kind of things. We have a pivoting away United States, an administration of MAGAs who have a perception with a lens of just that Islamist is just purely terrorist right away. And you have a situation, a region in itself that is also at some point being stretched. So here is really, I think, the theme of agency.
Yes.
Syrian agency and
Yes.
regional agency.
Yeah.
And I just want to go back to one point, and that Assad and Iyad mentioned about, in particular, I think also Iyad, when he said that there is no strings attached now when it comes to solving kind of, or when it comes to financial roles. But for me, and you're right, this is an opportunity, but this is not just an opportunity for Saudi Arabia only. This is an opportunity not only for Israel, for Syria only. My research comes out every time. This is an opportunity for Arab integration.
Yes.
If this support
Yes.
is then going, it has to make sense for us and it has to make sense for you. So let's cooperate. So there are opportunities, and of course, I'll just leave it open to everyone, whoever wants to take it. Go ahead. But Assad, do you wanna take it, and then we'll go back for perhaps a final round.
Absolutely. I mean, I cannot agree more with you, Aziz, that this is an opportunity for regional integration. And speaking of your research, Israel is part and parcel of that reality. Let's say, we've seen Israel's behavior in the past 10 days. What have they done? They went into Syria, occupied Mount Hermon, and occupied the buffer zone, right? And withdrew from the 1974 disengagement agreement, saying there is no counterpart, therefore we're out of the 1974 disengagement agreement. Then they did their largest air campaign in Israel's history, 480 sorties, destroying any strategic weaponry that might be at the hand of, or was at the hand of the Syrian army. I'm not going to sit here and shed tears about MiG-21s and MiG-23s. I'm glad they're gone. The newest fighter jet we had was probably 60 years old. So I'm not going to sit here and really, start crying about the great F-22s that we had, or the F-35s, right? So, but still, strategic weaponry in the hands of Syria has been, and something that Syrians have paid their lives for, and the regime extorted from their pockets, is gone. So we also need the Arab presence to kind of protect us from this, protect us from Israel. Given Turkey's ambiguous relationship with Israel, and especially after October 7th, Turkey cannot be the protector anymore when it vis-a-vis our southern neighbor. The only countries that can play that role are the Arab countries. Egypt and Jordan being on the border with Israel, but we need also the depth of the GCC, right, to support all of that. So not only we're talking about financial support, but we're also talking about political support and political protection. This is a nascent country. We have to look at this is our new Independence Day. You were looking at Syria of 1944, 1945. Right? This is what it is. I wish we had Shukri al-Watli. We don't. What can I do? We don't have Shukri al-Watli. But we have to do with what we have. Syrian agency is of the utmost, it's good to speak about which countries are going to contribute to Syria's reconstruction. But the first thing we need to talk about is when are the Syrian business people going back to reconstruct their country? There are many Syrian business people in the different GCC countries, in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, and I can go on and on. There are Syrian business people in the US. There are Syrian business people in Europe, in the UK. They need to put a Syrian trust fund. Bring your power together. And create a Syrian trust fund for reconstruction. You can do that as Syrian business people. So that's the Syrian agency we need today. And then there is a whole element that we haven't discussed much. I think Randa alluded to it a bit, but which is the northeast of the country, and what kind of relationship will develop today between the administration in Damascus and the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian Democratic Council, etc. We need the SDC and the SDF as a counterweight. We cannot get rid of the SDC and the SDF today because you need that balancing act. As much as we need the Arab depth as a balancing act to the Turkish power in the country, we need the SDF as a balancing power to the power in Damascus. Just to make sure that everything happens in an inclusive and not too violent way, and not too repressive as well. So part of the Arab world's role, given that Turkey will never do that, is to open up also to a dialogue with the Syrian Democratic Forces. I know the UAE did a bit of that, but that's not enough. We need the GCC as an entity and the Arab League also to engage with the Syrian Democratic Council, with the Syrian Democratic Forces. Engagement does not necessarily mean recognition, or does not necessarily mean acceptance of reality. But if we do not engage with them, my fear, my worry, and it's a worry that exists everywhere, is that we're going to see a country that is split in two, right? You have the Northeast going to the Kurds, American protecting them from any advances from the Turks, and the rest of the country completely controlled by the Turks if there's enough Arab presence. So what can also protect the territorial integrity, the territorial unity of Syria, is this Arab presence on the ground. Turkey doesn't really care about territorial integrity and territorial unity of Syria, except that it does not want a model there that could hammer or endanger its own country, right? Turkey. But the rest of the actors do not really care. Iran will continue to be, I love the celebratory moment of we won over Iran. We need to be very careful. We need to be very careful about statements we're making, because Iran is very good at changing colors and shifting priorities and shifting allegiances, and they flourish in chaos. They flourish in when you have many groups and many militias, etc., operating. And if we don't tend a hand to the new establishment in Damascus, my worry is Iran will. And we have the Hamas model in front of us, where there is a precedent where an extremist Sunni political body and armed body is supported by Iran. So And both Shara, Jolani, and Iran are pragmatic enough to realign. So, and time is of the essence, right? So all of that is, at play at the moment.
Thank you, Asad. Yeah, go ahead.
Surely, I just wanted to add on what Asad said. The pragmatic choices of the GCC states should be really what guide their diplomacy and foreign policy towards Syria. And we've seen those pragmatic moves since 2020. If you look at Sudan, Saudi Arabia did not take side with the fighting, parties in Sudan. If you look at Yemen, Saudi Arabia opened channels with Houthis, as with the legitimacy government. I think Saudi Arabia would be open to open channels with the SDF and other, factions in Syria, as versus to what Saudi Arabia chose at the beginning of the Arab uprisings, taking sides only with one of the fighting, forces in a given country. That really changed in the last few years, which give me hope that Saudi Arabia will engage with all players in those countries. Saudi Arabia stands against Islamists who have transnational appetite to really, to have influence over masses in different states, but it doesn't have any issue with Islamists like Al-Islah in Yemen, who are part of the Ikhwan of the Muslim Brotherhood, but they are different. Saudi Arabia started to take case by case Islamists and not generalize on Islamists, all across the Arab states or the Middle Eastern states. That's what gives me hope in that regard. I just wanted to add this.
Thank you. Yeah, this segues nicely also to the point that you mentioned, Randa, a few points that you mentioned. So you mentioned normalization, that it is a priority, that Saudi-Israeli normalization is a priority for MAGA, the third priority. Assad mentioned that it's what it's doing now in Syria. Also, I'm just wondering, when we were talking about the potentiality of normalization, that there had to be a Palestinian component, I don't think the Golan Heights was an obstacle for Saudi normalization before. Yeah, Assad was like, oh no, yeah, that was not no. Now, I'm just wondering, how does that complicate things? I'm being selfish now. I'm asking about my own research, but how do you see, did that complicate things now, given that I think Saudi needs to wants to engage in Syria more, the region needs Syria to be healthy?
I think that's a very good angle, Aziz. Very good questions. It's interesting. Going forward, already I think the Saudi demand of an irreversible pathway to a Palestinian state is a complicating factor. It's a very, very complicating factor as far as the Netanyahu government is concerned. As far, I mean, they don't see, they are not on board with this. And now, how much of an influence will people like Netanyahu have on US policy going forward versus in the past? I think with Trump, that's the interesting part, is that it's really, we don't know. I mean, when he was asked whether you trust Netanyahu, right, in a press conference, he said, I don't trust anybody. And that's vintage Trump. He doesn't trust anybody. I don't think he trusts his own family, and so his own kids. And so I think we really have to wait and see. There will be a lot of figures around him. What worries me is that there was no strategy, for the US, for the Middle East under the Biden administration, because I think they were not because for the lack of trying, not because for the lack of order just because, again, it was not a priority until October 7, right? But there has not been a strategy. And after that, it was taken over by Biden's support, unconditional support of Israel. What worries me about Trump, like what happened we saw in Trump 1.0, is the chaos, is that there will be no strategy because there are so many cooks in the kitchen and you don't have somebody there, up there, you know, who can make a decision and everybody will follow. Because the other thing that's known about Trump, he will decide based on the last person, on what he heard from the last person who spoke with him. I mean, that's also Trump. So that's, you know, are we going to have this? I think he has only this goal, which is this normalization between Saudi and Arabia and Israel. I think his son-in-law, who is not moving to DC, Jared Kushner, will be given pretty much control over that file. Watch also for his advisor on the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, who's going to be very influential in the next administration due to his personal links with Trump. But then what will Rubio as Secretary of State play? You know, what role will he play? What role will the next Secretary of Defense, I don't know if Hexat will be the one, will play? What will be the role of Tulsi Gabbard, you know, on that as Director of National Intelligence or the Director of the CIA? It's going to be very hard to predict how this maze of actors are going to be working together, partly because Trump does not have one hand, to be very honest, the attention span. Two, does not have the kind of, although he likes to say of himself as, you know, big negotiator, he doesn't have the managerial skills to, you know, bring everything under one particular vision, one particular order, except focusing on transactional businesses, you know, transactional issues. And maybe that's the only possibility today in the Middle East, focused on issue-based negotiation. This one issue, let's focus on it, let's get it done, right? So that's you know, and I'm afraid Syria is going to be lost in this mix. It's not going to be a priority. It's not going to, and different people in the administration will take care, will basically control that file, and, you know, will be fighting with each other over that file without any kind of supervisory role over them.
Thank you, Randa. I think just to sum up, probably on that note, it's just time for really not only, you know, the way out of here, which is a long way, has to come from Syria, but it also has to come from the region. And I think this is an opportunity. It has the challenges that you mentioned, and it has opportunity, and there's no time to waste. I think this is why I think I'm personally very pleased and honored and humbled that, you know, you've shared your fantastic insights, your expertise, really, to many of our audiences. I've learned a lot. I always do from you all. And I just want to thank you all for sharing this once again and joining us. This is the first session that we've done. So you guys are the alumni now. You guys are the all-stars. So I just really appreciate this. Thank you all so much for joining. And hopefully next time. Till next time.
Bye.